woman pointed at me in front of 300 guests and said I didn't belong at his table. What she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that 2 years ago I had held that man's life in my hands, and he had never forgotten. I have been in enough rooms to know the exact moment one decides it doesn't want me. It happens in the eyes first. A flicker, a quiet recalibration, the polished machinery of judgment running behind practiced smiles. My name is Florence Adeyemi. I am a trauma surgeon. I have held a beating heart in my bare hands at 2 a.m. I have delivered news that collapsed entire families and sat with them in the rubble without flinching. I do not need a room's permission to exist. But standing at the entrance of the Grand Meridian Ballroom tonight, gown the color of midnight, 300 guests beyond those doors, I felt it anyway. That familiar shift in the air when a black woman arrives somewhere she wasn't expected. I pressed the small scar on my left palm, a nervous habit I've carried for years. Then I walked in. Nadia, my best friend and the only human capable of getting me into heels without a negotiation, linked her arm through mine. "You look dangerous," she whispered. "Good," I said. The room was everything the invitation promised: crystal chandeliers, candlelight bouncing off champagne flutes, the kind of crowd where every name at every table had been in a newspaper. I had been invited as the keynote speaker for the Seoul Medical Charity Gala. I had prepared my speech for 3 weeks. I belonged here by every professional right that existed. And yet, at the far end of the room, at the head of the main table, sat a man who made every other person in the room feel like background. Still, unreadable. A black suit tailored like it was built for war. And, climbing from his collar, up the side of his neck, ink. Dark, deliberate tattoos that he had clearly stopped hiding a long time ago. He was already looking at me. Not glancing. Looking. Like he had been waiting. Have you ever walked into a room that tried to make you feel small, but you walked in anyway? Drop it in the comments. Florence's night is just beginning. The host had just called my name to approach the podium. I stood, smoothed my gown. Nadia gave me a small nod across the table. That was the moment Madame Choi chose. She rose from her seat 3 tables away. Silk dress, silver hair pinned perfectly, the practiced elegance of a woman who had spent decades deciding who mattered. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room's acoustics did the work. "Excuse me." Her tone was light, almost pleasant. "Before we continue, I feel someone should address the seating arrangement." The host paused. The room stilled. "This young woman," Madame Choi said, her eyes finding mine with a smile that was surgical. "I'm sure she's lovely, but the main table is reserved for guests of standing, not for—" she tilted her head, "whoever brought her here as company." 300 people heard every word. I stood completely still, the kind of still I had trained myself to find in operating rooms when everything is going wrong and you cannot afford to show it. Nadia's chair scraped the floor. I touched her arm without looking at her. "Don't." Madame Choi smiled wider. "There are seats near the back, sweetheart. More appropriate, I think." The silence in that room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I had been overlooked, underestimated, talked around, but I had never been pointed at, in front of 300 people, and told to move. I opened my mouth. I never got to speak. From the head of the table, a chair moved. Slow, deliberate. Jiwoo stood up, and the entire room stopped breathing. He didn't rush. That was the thing that silenced the room more than anything else. Jiwoo buttoned his jacket with the calm of a man who had decided outcomes far more consequential than this one, and walked toward me. Not toward Madame Choi. Toward me. He stopped at my side, pulled out the empty chair at the head table, directly to his right, and looked at me. "Dr. Adeyemi." His voice was low, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because rooms had been trained to go quiet when it spoke. "Please, sit." I looked at him. He looked back, patient, certain. I sat. The room exhaled, then tensed again because Jiwoo had not finished. He turned toward Madame Choi slowly, The way you face something you have already decided the outcome of. Madame Choi? He said her name once, just once. You spoke, at my table, at my event, about a guest I personally ensured was on this list. A pause that lasted exactly long enough. I won't be addressing this twice. Madame Choi's smile hadn't moved, but something behind it had. Jiwoo, I was simply, "You're done speaking for the evening," he said. Not a suggestion, not a warning, a fact delivered by a man who had never needed to repeat himself. He turned back to the room, nodded to the host. "Please continue." And the evening continued. But I felt Madame Choi's eyes on the back of my neck for the rest of it. Hot, still, calculating. She hadn't been embarrassed. She had been ignited, and I didn't know yet what that meant for me. He found me after the speeches on the terrace where I had stepped out to breathe properly for the first time in 2 hours. "Dr. Adeyemi." I turned. Up close he was less intimidating than I had expected, and more of something else I didn't have a name for yet. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "I'm fine." I looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He stood beside me, looked out at the city below. "I wanted to." Silence settled. Not uncomfortable. Strange, but not uncomfortable. "You don't know me," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "General Hospital," he said. 2 years ago, October, room 12 of the emergency trauma unit." I turned slowly. "A patient was brought in unconscious at 1 a.m., he continued. "Blunt force trauma to the chest. No identification. The attending on call performed emergency surgery alone for 5 hours. She stabilized him, sat with him until morning. When he woke up, she was already gone." He paused. "She never submitted a bill." My heart stopped moving inside my chest. I remembered that night. A man with no wallet, no phone, tattoos climbing his neck. The nurses had assumed the worst about him. I had assumed nothing, just worked. "That was you," I said. Not a question. Jiwoo looked at me directly. Something in his expression had opened, just slightly, like a door he had been standing behind for a very long time. "I have been trying to find you," he said quietly, "for 2 years." The city hummed below us. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I had absolutely nothing to say. He told me everything that night on the terrace. Madame Choi's daughter, Soo-yeon, had been positioned as his intended for years, a social arrangement built on shared business empires. Jiwoo had ended it 8 months ago, cleanly, completely, without apology. Madame Choi had never recovered from that refusal. She had since run quiet campaigns against every woman who entered Jiwoo's orbit. 3 women before me. None of them had sat at his table. I was the first he had publicly placed beside him. That was why she moved tonight. Not out of snobbery, out of fear. What I didn't know, what Jiwoo did not tell me on that terrace, was that even as we spoke, 3 calls had already been made. By morning, the first of Choi Industries' European business partners had quietly withdrawn from a pending contract. No explanation given. By the following evening, 2 board members of Madame Choi's foundation had received documents they could not ignore and could not return from. Jiwoo did not announce what he was doing. He simply began. Quietly, precisely, the way a man moves when he is not making a threat. He is delivering a consequence. I knew none of that then. I only knew that standing beside him in the cold night air, something inside me had shifted in a way I hadn't given it permission to. He had spent 2 years looking for the woman who saved his life and walked away without asking for a single thing. And she had spent those same 2 years never knowing she had left a piece of herself behind in that hospital room. That frightened me more than Madame Choi ever could. Have you ever had someone fight for you before you even knew they were in your corner? Tell me in the comments, because Jiwoo is just getting started. He called 3 days later. Not a text, a call. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "Somewhere quiet." I should have said no. I was already tangled in something I hadn't agreed to. A man with tattoos up his neck, an empire I didn't fully understand, and enemies who pointed at black women in ballrooms. I said yes. The restaurant had no printed menu. Just whatever the kitchen had decided that evening. Plates arriving without explanation, expected to be trusted. I trusted them. We talked for 3 hours. He asked questions the way he did everything. Fully. No performance. He wanted to know what made me choose surgery. What I did on days I wasn't saving anyone. What I was afraid of. I told him I was afraid of stillness. That if I stopped moving, I'd have to sit with how much I had sacrificed to build a life in rooms that never planned to include me. He was quiet after that. Then, I drive at night when I can't sleep. Just drive. Where? I asked. Nowhere. Everywhere. That's the loneliest thing I've ever heard. He looked at me. Come with me sometime. We drove that same night. City lights, music low, neither of us saying much. At one point I asked, "Is your mind always this quiet?" He said, "No, this is new." I watched the city blur past and understood, without wanting to, that I was already in trouble. Not the Madame Choi kind of trouble, the kind that quietly rearranges things inside you that you didn't know were movable. And the terrifying part was this. It didn't feel like falling. It felt like arriving somewhere I had been trying to find for a very long time. It appeared on 3 news sites simultaneously. 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. Surgeon under investigation. Romantic relationship with patient alleged. My name. My photograph. My hospital. The claim. I had entered a personal relationship with a patient while he was under my care. That my treatment decisions had been compromised. That the board was reviewing my conduct. My phone started ringing before I finished reading the headline. I drove to the hospital in silence, walked past colleagues who had already seen it, sat in my office and stared at the wall. The review board called me in at noon. I answered every question. My hands were steady. My voice was steady. Inside, I was coming apart. By evening, I knew the source. Choi Jun, Madame Choi's son, had fed 2 journalists fabricated documentation suggesting Ji-woo and I had been in contact while he was my patient. He had been unconscious for most of his time in my care. None of that mattered to a headline. I went to Ji-woo's office. He stood the moment I walked in. I didn't let him speak. "I saved your life," I said. "I asked for nothing. I never told a single person about that night." My voice almost broke. Almost. And now, everything I have spent 15 years building is being pulled apart because of you. Something in his face fractured, just slightly, like a wall he had maintained for years had finally found its fault line. "Florence." "Don't." I picked up my bag. "Whatever this is between us, I need you to leave me out of it." I walked out. He let me go. And that, somehow, was the thing that hurt the most. I didn't sleep for 2 days. I answered the board's questions, reviewed files, sat across from professionally neutral faces, the kind that have already decided and are simply completing the process. On the 3rd morning, they called me back in. A folder sat on the table. Inside, a complete chain of medical records, timestamps, surgical notes, post-operative reports, discharge documentation, proving Ji-woo had been fully discharged from my care 14 months before we ever exchanged a single word. Choi Jun's fabricated documents had been dismantled, forensically, completely. Alongside it, evidence that Choi Jun had paid the journalists directly, wire transfers, time-stamped messages, a paper trail so clean it could only have been assembled by someone who had been watching every move the Choi family made for months. "Where did this come from?" I asked. The board chair shifted slightly. "It was delivered anonymously this morning." Nothing about it was anonymous. I knew exactly where it came from. By evening, Choi Jun had been arrested. Evidence fabrication, criminal defamation. By the following morning, I had been fully cleared. I sat in my car outside the hospital for a long time. Then I drove to Ji-woo's building. He was standing outside it. No coat despite the cold. Hands in his pockets. looking at me the way he had looked at me across that ballroom the very first night, like he had been waiting long before tonight. "You didn't have to do it anonymously," I said. "You needed it to be yours," he said quietly, "not mine." Something inside my chest broke open in the best possible way. I walked toward him and didn't stop. 3 months later, Choi Industries filed for bankruptcy. The European contracts never returned. 3 government audits uncovered financial irregularities Madame Choi had buried for nearly a decade. Every alliance, every social connection, every carefully planted seed across 20 years dissolved faster than she had ever imagined possible. She lost the table. All of them. Soo-yeon came to find me on a quiet Wednesday morning at the hospital cafe. She sat down without asking permission. "My brother is facing trial," she said. "My mother hasn't left the house in weeks." She looked at her hands. "I need you to know I had no part in what they did." "I know," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He didn't choose me because something was wrong with me." She said it like she was pressing something down she'd been holding up for a very long time. "He simply never chose me to begin with. I just refused to accept it." She stood. "You didn't take anything from me, Florence. He chose. That's all it ever was." She left without looking back. I sat with my coffee until Nadia called. I picked up and said, "You are not going to believe what just happened." The proposal happened 6 weeks later. Jiwoo brought me back to General Hospital, room 12, the exact room where I had operated on him 2 years ago, not knowing his name, not asking for anything. He stood in the middle of it and looked at me. "You saved my life in this room," he said, and walked away without asking for a single thing. He reached into his jacket. "I'd like to spend the rest of mine making sure you never have to ask for anything again." He opened the box. I looked at the ring, looked at him, looked at the room where everything, without either of us knowing, had already begun. "Yes," I said, "that's a yes." If this story moved you, drop a comment with the moment that wrecked you. I read every single one, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you already know what to do. Florence and Jiwoo's story is just the beginning.